I always told my son that the true character of a man shows not when he has everything, but when he thinks you have nothing. Welcome back to the channel, Gather Around, because tonight we are talking about a man who built his entire world on a bruised foundation. The air inside the Georgian Terrace Hotel ballroom was thick with expensive perfume and the kind of forced laughter that only comes from people who are terrified of losing their status. Crystal chandeliers threw sharp light over 300 guests, all dressed in silk and tailored wool. Waiters in white coats circulated with trays of champagne, moving silently over the plush red carpet. At the center of it all, standing on a raised stage with a microphone in his hand, was Reginald Vance. Reginald was 75 years old, but he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. His suit was imported Italian wool, custom cut, to hide the slight stoop in his shoulders. He owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta, and he never let a single person in the room forget it. To his left stood my wife, Kendra. Kendra was 40 years old, radiant in an emerald evening gown, her back perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on her father with a cold, unblinking focus. And then there was me. I am Marcus, 42 years old, standing just off to the side of the stage, wearing a charcoal suit that Reginald had always called a little too off the rack. I had given 14 years of my life to Vance Enterprise, 14 years of early mornings, late nights, and swallowing my pride every time Reginald looked at me like I was a mistake his daughter had made. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of his 50 years in business. It was supposed to be a graceful transition of power. Instead, it was an execution. Reginald tapped the microphone and the high-pitched whine made the entire room go dead silent. He looked out over the crowd of politicians, bankers, and socialites. Then he turned his head slowly and locked his eyes directly on me. "We all know that building an empire takes a certain kind of blood," Reginald said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "It takes vision. It takes ruthlessness, and it takes an intellect that cannot be taught." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his stare push down on my shoulders. Unfortunately, he continued, "Not everyone in my family possesses those traits." A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. Kendra tightened her jaw, but she did not move. I kept my face completely blank. "Some men," Reginald said, leaning into the microphone, "are content to ride the coattails of greatness. Some men think that marrying into a legacy is the same thing as earning one." He pointed a finger at me, the diamond pinky ring catching the chandelier light. "Marcus here has been pretending to run my operations for over a decade, but let us be honest with ourselves tonight. A man who cannot close a simple deal without holding my hand has no business sitting in my boardroom." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the clink of a glass halfway across the hall. Reginald smiled, a thin, cruel stretch of his lips. "I built this company from dirt," he said, his voice rising, filling the massive space. "I own the buildings you work in. I own the banks that hold your money, and I will not hand my crown to a man who does not know how to fight. As of this exact second, Marcus, you are relieved of your duties. You are fired." Someone in the back gasped. Reginald just stood there, soaking in the shock, feeding on the absolute power he held over the room. He expected me to shout. He expected me to beg to turn red, to cause a scene that would validate his cruelty. I did absolutely nothing. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the stale, conditioned air fill my lungs. I looked at Reginald, really looked at him, and I saw exactly what he was. A terrified, hollow old mote wrapping himself in money to hide the rot inside. Then I looked at Kendra. We did not need to speak. We had spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact moment, waiting for his arrogance to finally outgrow his caution. Kendra looked at me, her eyes steady, her posture unbroken. She gave me one single microscopic nod. That was all I needed. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my heavy gold-plated company access badge. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. A waiter was standing frozen nearby, holding a silver tray full of empty champagne flutes. I stopped in front of him and gently placed the gold badge onto the silver tray. The heavy clack of metal on metal echoed loud in the quiet room. I turned my back on Reginald Vance and I walked down the center aisle. 300 of the most powerful people in Atlanta parted from me, stepping back as if I were made of fire. I did not look left, and I did not look right. I pushed through the heavy brass double doors of the ballroom, walked across the marble lobby, and stepped out into the thick, humid Atlanta night. The heat hit my face, smelling of wet asphalt and blooming jasmine. The city was alive traffic, moving slowly down Peachtree Street, completely unaware of the empire that had just cracked wide open. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. Andre answered, his voice low and sharp against the background noise of a busy restaurant. "Talk to me," Andre said. I looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers reflecting the streetlights like massive monuments. "It is done," I said, my voice calmer than it had been in 14 years. "Pull the trigger on Section 14. The morning sun broke over the Buckhead skyline, heavy and hot. Reginald Vance woke up in his penthouse apartment, the faint headache from expensive champagne still sitting behind his eyes. He felt powerful. He felt completely untouchable. He had cut the dead weight from his family, and he had done it in front of the entire city. He threw back the silk covers and walked to the massive windows. He looked down at the streets of Atlanta, smiling a slow, satisfied smile. He did not know it yet, but the empire he was looking at no longer belonged to him. He walked into his marble bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was an alert from his bank. He picked it up, expecting his daily balance update. Instead, it was an automated fraud warning. His primary luxury card, the one with no spending limit, had been declined. It was declined for a simple recurring country club fee. Reginald scoffed, tossing the phone aside onto the counter. A clerical error, he muttered to himself. He dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, adjusted his silk tie, and headed for the private elevator. He rode down to the executive garage, expecting the familiar sight of his sedan with the engine running. The car was parked in its usual spot, but his driver, a quiet man named Thomas, was leaning against a concrete pillar. Thomas was not holding the door open. He was holding a small cardboard box filled with his personal items. Reginald frowned, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly in the empty garage. "Thomas," he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. "What are you doing? Open the door right now. I have an early meeting with the zoning board." Thomas stood up straight, but he did not move toward the car. "I cannot do that, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice quiet but very firm. Reginald stopped walking. He stared at the driver, genuinely confused by the defiance. "What did you just say to me?" Reginald asked, his tone dripping with immediate threat. "I said I cannot do that," Thomas repeated, looking Reginald directly in the eye. "The fleet management company called me 20 minutes ago. The lease on this car and the other 3 executive vehicles has been fully suspended. The corporate accounts have been frozen." Reginald felt a cold spike of panic drop straight into his stomach. Frozen, he repeated the words, sounding entirely absurd in his mouth. "Do you know who I am? Call them back right now and tell them to fix this mistake." Thomas shook his head slowly. "It is not a mistake, sir," he replied. "My direct deposit paycheck bounced this morning. The fleet agency told me to hand over the keys to the tow truck driver. He is pulling into the garage right now." Reginald turned his head rapidly. He saw the flashing yellow lights of a heavy tow truck reflecting off the gray concrete walls. His breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. This was a nightmare playing out in real time. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly, and dialed his chief financial officer. The call went straight to an automated voicemail. He cursed loudly, pacing back and forth on the concrete. He dialed his private wealth banker, a man who was highly paid to answer his phone at 3 in the morning. Voicemail again. The dead silence on the other end of the line was absolutely deafening. Reginald turned away from the luxury car, his chest suddenly very tight. He stormed out of the parking garage and walked out into the blinding morning sun. He stood on the busy public sidewalk, a man used to private jets and tinted windows, desperately waving his hand to hail a city taxi. A battered yellow cab pulled over. Reginald yanked the door open and slid onto the worn plastic seat. "Take me to Vance Enterprise headquarters," he ordered the driver, his voice trembling with a terrifying new reality. "Drive fast." The driver hit the gas, and Reginald stared out the dirty window, his mind racing wildly. Something was horribly wrong, and he had a sudden sickening feeling that Marcus was the one holding the matches. The yellow cab abruptly pulled up to the towering glass facade of Vance Enterprise headquarters. Reginald threw a $50 bill at the driver and did not wait for the change. He marched through the massive revolving doors, his face a mask of absolute fury. The marble lobby, usually bustling with eager employees, felt strangely tense. Security guards looked away as he passed. The receptionist kept her eyes glued to her computer monitor. Reginald ignored them all, stepping into his private elevator and riding it all the way up to the 50th floor. When the steel doors slid open, he expected to see his executive assistant waiting with a fresh coffee and a morning schedule. Instead, the reception desk was empty. The entire executive floor was unnervingly quiet. He walked rapidly down the long corridor, his shoes sinking into the thick carpet until he reached the heavy oak doors of his corner office. He pushed them open and stopped dead in his tracks. His massive mahogany desk, usually perfectly organized, was completely covered in thick stacks of paper. Red urgency labels and legal seals were plastered across the tops of the documents. Standing behind the desk, looking pale and sweating profusely, was David, his chief financial officer. David looked up, his hands shaking slightly as he held a thick legal binder. "Where have you been?" Reginald demanded, slamming the oak door shut behind him. "My car is gone. My cards are declining, and my calls are going straight to voicemail. What in the world is happening to my company?" David swallowed hard, looking down at the scattered papers. "It is not a glitch, Reginald," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The banks initiated an emergency freeze at 6 o'clock this morning. Every line of credit we have is suspended." Reginald walked slowly toward the desk, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Suspended, he repeated, leaning his knuckles on the smooth wood. "On whose authority?" "We have hundreds of millions in collateral." "That is exactly the problem," David said, sliding a thick document across the desk. "The collateral is gone. Someone triggered a massive asset excision late last night." Reginald picked up the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His vision blurred for a second as the reality of the words hit him. The document was a formal notice of equity execution. It cited Section 14, subsection C of the original corporate charter, a clause that stated any executive terminated without documented cause in a public setting was immediately entitled to a severance payout equal to 18% of the total company equity. 18%. Reginald whispered the air, completely leaving his lungs. He read the name at the bottom of the execution order. It was Marcus. "He triggered it at midnight," David explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Because he filed the claim legally, and with immediate cause, the courts placed a mandatory hold on our operating accounts to protect his share." "But it gets worse, Reginald." Reginald looked up, his face drained of all color. "How could it possibly get worse?" he asked. David pointed a trembling finger at a secondary stack of notices. You used that 18% as backing collateral for the high-yield development loans in Midtown. The banks received an automated alert that the collateral was no longer viable. They are calling the loans Reginald. All of them. They want $80 million in cash by the end of the week, or they will begin seizing the properties. The opulent corner office, with its panoramic views of the city, suddenly felt like a very small, very tight box. Reginald dropped the legal notice onto the desk, his hands completely numb. For 14 years, he had treated Marcus like a stray dog, feeding him scraps and kicking him when he felt like it. He never bothered to read the fine print of the contracts Marcus drafted. He never realized that the quiet, patient man he had mocked on stage just 12 hours ago had built a perfectly legal, completely invisible trapdoor right under his feet. And last night, in front of the entire city, Reginald had happily stepped right onto it. Reginald stumbled out of the massive glass building to moving like a man walking in his sleep. The Georgia heat pushed down on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. He needed to think, he needed to strategize, but his mind was spinning in endless, terrifying circles. His phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw his young wife Jasmine calling him for the 4th time. Jasmine was 32, sharp, beautiful, and completely accustomed to a life without limits. Reginald swiped the screen to answer, pressing the phone to his ear. "Reginald, what is going on?" Jasmine demanded, her voice tight and high-pitched. "I'm at the Piedmont Country Club and the manager just pulled me out of the dining room. He pulled me out in front of everyone, Reginald." Reginald closed his eyes, leaning his back against the hot concrete of a building. "Just go home, Jasmine," he said, his voice ragged. "There is a small problem with the accounts. I'm handling it." "A small problem?" She practically screamed into the phone. "The manager told me our membership was suspended for insufficient funds, my premium card was declined at the spa, and my personal trainer just texted me that his retainer bounced." "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" she asked, the panic bleeding through her anger. The women were staring at me, Reginald. They were whispering. "I said I will fix it," Reginald shouted, his own panic finally breaking through his carefully controlled exterior. "Just go back to the penthouse and wait for me." He hung up the phone, completely exhausted. He managed to hail another city cab, riding back to Buckhead in complete silence. When he finally walked through the heavy double doors of his penthouse, the scene, waiting for him, was worse than the boardroom. Jasmine was pacing across the marble floor, her expensive clothes looking completely out of place against her frantic energy. She had a tablet in her hand, aggressively scrolling through account balances. "Zero," she said, not even looking up when he walked in. "Every single liquid account is showing a zero balance. The joint accounts, the offshore holding accounts, even my personal shopping allowance account. Who is freezing our money, Reginald?" Reginald walked over to the massive leather sofa and collapsed into it. He felt 75 years old for the very first time in his life. "Marcus," he whispered, staring blankly at the wall. Marcus executed a severance clause. He took 18% of the equity and the banks panicked. Jasmine finally looked up, her face twisting in pure disbelief. "Marcus," she repeated, scoffing loudly. "The son-in-law you humiliated on stage last night, the man you told me was too weak to run a corner store. That Marcus." Reginald nodded slowly, unable to look her in the eye. "He set a trap," Reginald said, his voice hollow. "And I walked right into it in front of the entire city." Jasmine dropped the tablet onto the glass coffee table. The loud smack echoed through the massive, quiet room. "I married a king, Reginald," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, vicious register. "I did not marry a fool who gets outsmarted by his own shadow. If you do not fix this by tomorrow, I'm calling my lawyers and I'm leaving you with whatever is left of this mess." She turned on her heel and walked down the long hallway, slamming the heavy bedroom door behind her. Reginald sat completely alone in his empty, silent penthouse. The walls of his empire were cracking, the ceiling was caving in, and the worst part was he knew the real storm had not even arrived yet. Across town, far away from the panic echoing in Buckhead, the atmosphere was entirely different. I sat in a sleek leather chair on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. The office belonged to Vanessa. Vanessa was 50 years old, sharp as broken glass, and widely known as the most ruthless corporate lawyer in Atlanta. She did not lose, she did not settle, and she absolutely lived for the moment a bully realized he was trapped. Vanessa walked into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She was holding a thick, pristine legal folder. She dropped it onto the glass table between us. The slap of the paper was loud and heavy, and incredibly satisfying. "It is locked down, Marcus," Vanessa said, sitting across from me, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. "I filed the injunction at midnight, just like we planned. The courts approved the freeze at exactly 6 in the morning. I looked at the folder, but I did not open it. I did not need to. I had memorized every single word of Section 14, subsection C, 3 years ago." "Has he tried to fight it yet?" I asked, leaning back in the chair. Vanessa laughed a dry, humorless sound. "His lawyers have been calling my office since 8 o'clock, she said, crossing her arms. "They are threatening everything from a countersuit to criminal extortion. But they have absolutely nothing. The clause is airtight. It is in his own founding charter, and he fired you publicly with no documented cause. You own the leverage now, Marcus. All of it." Kendra walked into the office carrying 2 cups of black coffee. She handed one to me and sat down next to Vanessa. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking over the sprawling city that her father had always claimed as his own. "He's probably tearing his penthouse apart right now," Kendra said quietly, taking a slow sip of her coffee. I took a drink of my coffee, feeling the heat settle in my chest. "He is tearing it apart because he thinks this is just about money," I said, looking at both of them. "He thinks he can just write a check or intimidate a judge, and this will all go away. He does not realize that the 18% is not the actual weapon." Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with intense focus. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the heavy legal folder. "You are right, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping into a low, serious tone. "The equity claim is just the key to unlock the vault, and what I found inside that vault is going to destroy him." Vanessa opened the heavy folder and slid a thick stack of bank transfers across the smooth glass table. "These are not standard corporate loans," she said, tapping a manicured finger against a series of blacked-out routing numbers. "Reginald has been broke for 3 years. He has been running Vance Enterprise on fumes and aggressively leveraging the company against private, unregulated debt." "Private debt from who?" Kendra asked, leaning closer to examine the dense financial papers. Vanessa looked up at Kendra, and her expression turned dead serious. "Shadow investors out of Chicago," she said quietly, letting the words hang in the air. "The kind of men who do not send polite collection letters, the kind of men who send violent people to your front door. Reginald borrowed $50 million to cover a massive, catastrophic real estate failure back in 2019. He's been quietly embezzling your company operating funds just to pay the monthly interest. And to secure the primary principal of that shadow loan, he pledged the entire corporate equity pool as a guarantee, including your 18% Marcus." I stared at the offshore routing numbers, feeling a deep, cold chill run straight down my spine. "That is why the bank freeze is so lethal to him," I said, the entire puzzle suddenly snapping into perfect clarity. "The legitimate banks locked his operating accounts, which means he cannot make his illegal cash interest payment to Chicago. And the court-ordered equity hold means his underlying collateral is completely untouchable." "Exactly." Vanessa nodded, sitting back in her chair with a look of pure professional satisfaction. "He is completely exposed. The moment those Chicago investors realize the collateral is locked up in a severance dispute, they are going to come looking for him. And they are not going to ask for a meeting." Back in Buckhead, The hot Atlanta sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark orange shadows across the pristine marble floors of Reginald Vance's penthouse. The oppressive silence of the massive apartment was suddenly broken by a heavy rhythmic knocking at the front door. Reginald jumped, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The building's security desk was supposed to call up before anyone was ever allowed to access the private elevator. He walked slowly down the long hallway, his hands shaking slightly, and checked the digital security monitor mounted on the wall. The glowing screen showed two large men wearing dark, poorly fitted suits. They did not look like corporate lawyers, and they certainly did not look like investment bankers. They looked like professional violence. Reginald swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, and opened the heavy wooden door just a few inches. "Yes," he asked, his voice trembling and weak. The taller man pushed the door all the way open, forcing Reginald to stumble backward into the foyer. The man walked directly into the penthouse, looking around at the expensive modern art and the dripping crystal chandeliers with a look of utter, terrifying disgust. "Reginald Vance," the man said, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "We represent the Chicago Holding Group. You missed your wire transfer this morning." Reginald held his trembling hands up, taking another slow step back. "It is a simple banking error," he stammered, sweat instantly pouring down his wrinkled face. "My accounts are temporarily frozen due to a petty internal employee dispute. I will have the cash cleared and wired by Monday morning, I swear to you." The second man stepped inside and calmly closed the penthouse door behind him. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt locking sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Our employers do not care about your employee disputes," the second man said quietly, walking slowly toward Reginald. "They only care about the $50 million you owe them. We received a system alert today stating that your primary collateral has been legally compromised. It is a misunderstanding." Reginald pleated his back, hitting the cold, hard wall of the hallway. "I am the sole uncontested owner of Vance Enterprise. The equity is perfectly secure." The tall man stepped right into Reginald's personal space, towering over the older man. He reached out with a massive hand, grabbed the lapel of Reginald's custom Italian suit, and pulled him aggressively close. "You have exactly 72 hours. The tall man whispered, his hot breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. 72 hours to unfreeze those accounts and transfer our money. If the wire does not hit our account by Friday night, we are going to take the buildings, and then we are going to take you." The man shoved Reginald backward against the wall, let go of the expensive suit, and turned around. The two men walked out the door in perfect silence, leaving it hanging wide open to the hallway. Reginald slid slowly down the painted wall, hitting the marble floor with a heavy, defeated thud. He pulled his knees up to his chest, gasping for air in his own home. He was completely out of time, he was entirely out of money, and he was officially out of options. The arrogance that had built his towering empire had finally dug his grave. Desperation makes a man do things he would normally find completely beneath him. Reginald Vance had spent his entire life living in the bright light of public approval, but on a humid Tuesday night, he drove a rented sedan deep into the industrial shadows of West Atlanta. He parked in an alley behind a crumbling brick warehouse far away from the shiny glass towers he owned. He pulled up the collar of his dark coat and stepped out into the damp air. There were no cameras here and there were no witnesses. He walked up to a rusted steel door and knocked 3 times. The door opened inward, revealing a small, brightly lit room. The room smelled heavily of ink and stale tobacco. Sitting behind a desk covered in glowing monitors and digital scanners was a man named Elias. Elias did not wear expensive suits, and he did not care about the social registry. He cared about money, and he possessed a very specific, highly illegal skill set. "You are a long way from Buckhead, Mr. Vance," Elias said, not looking up from his computer screen. Reginald closed the heavy steel door, locking it behind him. I need a document, Reginald said, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. A corporate waiver backdated to exactly 3 years ago. I need it to state that my former executive voluntarily surrendered his rights to Section 14, subsection C of my company charter. Elias stopped typing and spun around in his chair. He looked at Reginald, his eyes scanning the desperate sweat on the older man's face. Backdating a corporate charter waiver is difficult, Elias said smoothly. Faking the digital signature of a man who is currently destroying you is incredibly dangerous. The courts use advanced biometric verification now. A simple pen on paper forgery will not survive a legal deposition. Reginald walked up to the desk and placed a thick stack of $100 bills onto the cluttered surface. I did not ask for a lecture. Reginald snapped, his old arrogance momentarily breaking through his fear. I asked for a solution. I have 72 hours before men from Chicago tear my life apart. Give me a solution right now. Elias looked at the money and smiled a thin, greedy smile. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small, flat piece of black glass. It looked exactly like a standard digital notary pad, the kind used in corporate boardrooms across the world. He set it on the desk next to the cash. This is a biometric capture device, Elias explained, tapping the black glass. It does not just record a simple signature. It records the pressure, the speed, and the unique thermal heat of the finger holding the stylus. I will draft the fake waiver on my secure servers. All you need to do is get your son-in-law to sign this pad. The device will capture his biometric data and perfectly overlay it onto the fake document. The court system will recognize it as 100% authentic. Reginald picked up the cold glass pad, staring at his distorted reflection in the dark screen. How am I supposed to get him to sign it? Reginald asked, looking up at the forger. He will not even take my phone calls. He knows we are at war. Elias swept the stack of cash into his open desk drawer. That is your problem, Mr. Vance, Elias said, turning back to his glowing monitors. But I suggest you figure it out quickly. The clock is ticking, and I hear the men from Chicago are not very patient. Reginald walked out of the warehouse, holding the digital pad tightly against his chest. He got back into the rented sedan, his mind racing with dark, vicious possibilities. He could not force Marcus to sign the pad. Marcus was younger, stronger, and completely aware of the high stakes. He needed Marcus to be helpless. He needed Marcus to be compliant. Reginald drove through the empty streets, his knuckles perfectly white on the steering wheel. A terrible, desperate plan began to form in his mind. He remembered a specific prescription medication, a heavy liquid sedative his private doctor had given him for severe anxiety, a drug that, when mixed with strong alcohol, made a man incredibly groggy, confused, and completely unable to form clear memories. Reginald settled in the dark car. It was a cold, ugly smile. He was going to pay a surprise visit to his daughter, and he was going to play the role of a broken, apologetic father. Reginald drove the rented sedan back to the underground garage of his Buckhead high-rise, his mind focused entirely on the grim task ahead. He took the service elevator, completely avoiding the front desk, and slipped quietly into his sprawling penthouse. The massive apartment was dark and painfully silent. Jasmine was asleep in the master suite, entirely unaware of the criminal depths her husband was sinking into. Reginald did not turn on the main lights. He walked like a ghost through the lavish living room, heading directly to his private study. He closed the heavy oak doors behind him and locked them with a dull click. He moved behind his mahogany desk, dropped to one knee, and entered the secure code into his floor safe. The heavy metal door swung open, revealing stacks of suddenly useless property deeds in a small velvet-lined medical box. He pulled the box out, placing it carefully on the desk under the focused beam of a single brass lamp. Inside the box, resting on the soft velvet, was a small glass vial of clear, heavy liquid. It was a potent pharmaceutical-grade sedative prescribed by a highly paid, very discreet private doctor. Reginald unscrewed the black plastic cap, staring at the thick liquid under the yellow light. He knew the dangerous dosage instructions by heart. 3 drops would induce a deep, dreamless sleep. 7 drops, especially when mixed with strong, dark bourbon, would severely impair basic motor functions, completely destroy short-term memory, and turn a grown, intelligent man into a compliant, waking shell. Reginald pulled a glass eyedropper from the box. His hands, which had been shaking violently for 2 entire days, were suddenly completely steady. The sheer desperation of his situation had finally burned away his panic, leaving only cold, calculated malice behind. He squeezed the rubber bulb, drawing the heavy liquid up into the glass tube. He watched it bead at the tip, holding his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He transferred exactly 7 drops of the clear poison into a tiny, concealed plastic travel vial. He screwed the lid on tight and slipped it securely into the right pocket of his trousers. Next, he picked up the cold black glass biometric pad he had purchased from the forger. He polished it with his sleeve, making sure the surface was perfectly clean, and slid it into his inner jacket pocket right next to his pounding heart. He had the weapon, and he had the trap. But the physical tools were simply not enough. Reginald knew Kendra was incredibly smart, and he knew Marcus was cautious and deeply observant. To get past their locked front door, to get close enough to pour a drink, he could not look like the arrogant king of Atlanta real estate. He needed a flawless disguise. He walked slowly into his expansive dressing room, stripping off his custom-tailored suit jacket and his imported silk tie. He threw the expensive garments onto the floor, treating them like garbage. He dug deep into the back of his massive closet and pulled out a faded, oversized gray sweater. It was a piece of cheap clothing he had not worn in over a decade, kept only for gardening on his private estate. He pulled it over his head, letting it hang loosely on his frame. He messed up his perfectly styled silver hair, pushing it wildly over his forehead. He removed his expensive gold watch and his heavy diamond pinky ring, tossing them onto the dresser. Reginald stood in front of the full-length mirror, studying his reflection in the dim light. He slouched his shoulders forward, purposely mimicking the defeated posture of a beaten man. He looked old, he looked exhausted, and he looked entirely harmless. It was without a doubt the greatest lie he had ever constructed. He cleared his throat, practicing his lines to the empty room. "Kendra? I am so sorry," he whispered, forcing his voice to crack perfectly on the final syllable. "I've lost absolutely everything, and I just want my family back." He stared into his own cold eyes in the mirror and nodded slowly. It was incredibly convincing. It was pathetic enough to bypass their defenses. He looked at the gold clock sitting on his dresser. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. It was the perfect, vulnerable time for a desperate, unannounced apology. Reginald grabbed his car keys and left the quiet penthouse. He stepped back into the humid, sprawling Atlanta night, armed with liquid poison, a forged legal document, and a perfectly crafted performance. He was fully prepared to commit a felony to steal his broken empire back from the man he despised. The drive to the quiet tree-lined streets of Cascade took exactly 25 minutes. Reginald parked his rented car 2 blocks away, leaving it completely hidden in the dark. He walked slowly up the winding driveway, approaching the beautiful 2-story brick home that Marcus and Kendra had built together. The house was warm, glowing with soft yellow light from the front windows. It was a home built on actual love and mutual respect. 2 things Reginald Vance had never truly understood. He stepped up onto the wide front porch, taking a deep, calculated breath. He dropped his shoulders, let his hands begin to tremble, and pressed the doorbell. The soft chime echoed deep inside the house. Inside, I was sitting on the living room sofa, going over the final trust documents with Kendra. When the doorbell rang at 10:15 at night, we both froze. We did not get late-night visitors. I set the papers down and walked to the front door, looking through the security camera monitor on the wall. I saw a hunched, pathetic-looking figure standing on my porch in a cheap gray sweater. I almost did not recognize him. "It is your father," I said quietly, turning to look at Kendra. She walked over, looking at the glowing screen. Her eyes narrowed, studying the man who had tormented her mother and terrorized our marriage. "He's wearing a gardening sweater." Kendra whispered, a cold smile touching her lips. "He is playing a role, Marcus. He is completely cornered, and now he is trying to act like a victim." I nodded, unlocking the deadbolt and pulling the heavy front door open. The humid night air spilled into the foyer, bringing Reginald with it. He stood there on my porch, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. The street lamp caught the moisture on his face. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly convincing performance. "Marcus," Reginald whispered, his voice cracking perfectly in the middle of my name. "Please do not shut the door. Please just give me 3 minutes." I stood completely still, blocking the doorway with my body. "What do you want, Reginald?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of any emotion. "I have lost it all," he choked out, bringing a shaking hand up to wipe his eyes. "The banks took everything this morning. My accounts are gone, my wife will not look at me, and my legacy is completely destroyed." He looked past me, catching sight of Kendra standing in the hallway. "Kendra, my beautiful girl," he cried, stepping forward and leaning heavily against the doorframe. "I am so deeply sorry. I was a terrible father, and I was a cruel, foolish old man." He let out a ragged, pathetic seep, his shoulders heaving under the oversized sweater. The performance was a masterclass in manipulation. If I had not spent 14 years watching him destroy people for sport, I might have actually felt sorry for him. I might have believed that the 75-year-old man crying on my porch was truly broken. "I have nowhere else to go." Reginald wept, looking down at the porch floor. "I just want to sit down. My chest hurts, Marcus. I just need a glass of water and 5 minutes to apologize to my family before I walk away forever." I looked at Kendra over my shoulder. We had prepared for threats. We had prepared for high-powered lawyers and angry phone calls. But we knew exactly what to do when the wolf showed up wearing sheep clothing. You do not lock the wolf out. You invite him inside and you let him step directly into the trap. Kendra looked at her father, her face a mask of perfectly faked sympathy. "Let him in, Marcus," she said softly, playing her part flawlessly. "He looks like he's going to collapse." I stepped aside, leaving the doorway completely open. "Come inside, Reginald," I said, pointing toward the living room. "Sit down before you fall down." Reginald shuffled past me, his head hung low, keeping up the act of a completely defeated man. He walked slowly into my home, unaware that every single corner of the room was covered by hidden security cameras. He thought he was walking into a sanctuary to execute his final vicious plan. But as I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt behind him, I knew the absolute truth. He was walking directly into his own tomb. Reginald sat heavily on our living room sofa, letting out a long, ragged sigh. He buried his face in his hands, playing the broken man to absolute perfection. I walked over to the custom bar in the corner of the room, pulling a crystal glass from the shelf. I asked if he wanted water, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Reginald looked up, his eyes red and watery. "A small glass of bourbon," he whispered, "if you would not mind." "My nerves are completely shot, Marcus. I just need something strong to calm my racing heart." I nodded slowly, turning my back to him. I reached for the heavy square bottle of expensive bourbon we kept on the top shelf. I poured a generous measure into his glass and poured a second glass for myself. As I turned around to hand him his drink, he cleared his throat nervously. "Do you have any ice, Marcus?" he asked, pointing a shaking finger at the small silver bucket on the far end of the bar. My stomach is in knots, and I cannot drink it neat. Of course, I said, turning my back to him once again to reach for the silver ice tongs. As I reached across the bar, I looked up at the reflective mirror mounted directly behind the glass shelves. The mirror gave me a perfect unobstructed view of the sofa behind me. In that clear reflection, I watched the frail, defeated old man suddenly vanish. Reginald sat up perfectly straight, his movements fast and incredibly sharp. He reached into the right pocket of his oversized sweater and pulled out a small plastic travel vial. He leaned across the coffee table, holding the vial directly over my glass of bourbon. I watched him squeeze the rubber top, dropping exactly 7 drops of clear liquid right into my drink. He slipped the vial back into his pocket and slumped his shoulders again, returning to his pathetic posture in less than 3 seconds. I picked up a large cube of ice, dropped it into his glass, and turned around. I set his drink on the coffee table right in front of him, and I picked up my poison glass, sitting down in the leather armchair directly across from the sofa. Reginald picked up his glass with 2 shaking hands, taking a small, slow sip. "Thank you," he said, letting out a deep, dramatic breath. He reached into his inner jacket pocket under the cheap gray sweater and pulled out a small, flat, black glass device. He set the digital pad on the coffee table. "It is a formal, legally binding apology." He lied, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I want you to read it, Marcus. I want you to know that I am surrendering completely." He pointed a trembling finger at the pad. "But please," he begged, looking me right in the eyes, "take a drink with me first. One final toast between 2 men to bury the past." I looked at the black glass pad, and then I looked at the old man sitting across from me. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He needed me to drink so the heavy sedative would take effect, allowing him to force my thumb onto that biometric scanner. I raised my glass, holding it up in the quiet room. "To the truth, Reginald," I said smoothly. "To the truth," he echoed, a dark, hungry light flashing in his eyes. I brought the crystal glass to my lips, tilting my head back. I let the strong smell of the bourbon fill my nose, but I did not let a single drop of the poisoned liquid touch my tongue. I faked a heavy swallow, letting the liquid pool temporarily in my mouth and later spitting it into a napkin when he briefly looked away. I lowered the glass, placing it carefully on the side table. Reginald watched me intensely, waiting for the poison to hit my bloodstream. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I waited exactly 2 minutes, listening to him ramble about his fake regrets before I let my eyelids flutter. I slumped my shoulders forward, letting my head drop slightly toward my chest. "Marcus," Reginald asked, his voice suddenly dropping its pathetic tone. "Are you feeling all right?" I mumbled a slurred, confused response, letting my hand fall limply onto my lap. "I am just," I whispered, dragging the words out, very tired all of a sudden. The room is spinning. Reginald stood up from the sofa, moving with terrifying speed. The old frail man was completely gone. He grabbed the black glass pad from the table, stepping right up to my chair. He grabbed my right wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled my heavy hand up. "Just sign the apology, Marcus." He ordered, his voice cold, sharp, and completely ruthless. "Just press your thumb right here and this will all be over." I kept my eyes half closed, playing the role of the heavily drugged victim. I let my body go completely limp, offering zero physical resistance. Reginald forced my hand down, pressing my right thumb firmly against the glowing center of the digital screen. The biometric pad beeped once, a sharp, high-pitched sound capturing my thermal signature and sealing the forged waiver forever. Reginald laughed, a cruel, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet living room. He dropped my hand, letting it fall dead against the armrest. He picked up the digital pad, slipping it safely back into his pocket, completely convinced that he had just stolen his massive empire back. Reginald stood over me, his chest heaving with arrogant, unchecked triumph. He looked down at my slumped body, and he smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. "You were always a passenger, Marcus," he whispered, leaning in so close that I could smell the stale coffee and pure fear on his breath. "You thought you could take my kingdom just because you found a piece of paper. But you do not have the stomach for real blood." He turned his back on me, walking briskly toward the front door. He did not stumble and his hands did not shake. The pathetic weeping old man routine was completely packed away, replaced entirely by the ruthless tyrant who had ruled Atlanta for 30 years. He pulled the heavy front door open, stepping out into the thick, humid night air. He pulled the door shut behind him, and the heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a solid, final sound. I waited exactly 10 seconds, listening to the heavy crunch of his expensive shoes fading down the concrete driveway. Then I sat up perfectly straight, wiping my right thumb vigorously against the thick fabric of my trousers. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled napkin containing the bourbon I had faked swallowing, and tossed it onto the coffee table. Kendra walked out from the dark hallway, shadows, holding a sleek silver tablet in her hands. She was not crying, and she was not trembling. She looked absolutely radiant, her face illuminated by the soft blue light of the glowing screen. "Did you get it?" I asked, rolling my stiff shoulders to work out the heavy tension of the performance. Kendra did not answer immediately. She walked slowly over to the leather sofa, sitting in the exact spot her father had just vacated. She swiped her finger across the smooth glass of the tablet and pressed play. The hidden camera footage was absolutely flawless. We had spent thousands of dollars installing 3 high-definition wide-angle lenses just 2 days ago. One was hidden inside the ceiling smoke detector. One was tucked seamlessly behind the heavy books on the top shelf. And the final one, the most important one of all, was embedded directly into the wooden frame of the custom bar mirror. I walked over and leaned down to look over her shoulder. The screen showed Reginald in crystal clear 4,000 pixel resolution, pulling the small plastic vial from his pocket. The sensitive room microphones picked up the tiny wet sound of the glass dropper. We watched him squeeze exactly 7 drops of the clear liquid poison directly into my glass of expensive bourbon. We watched him quickly hide the vial, and we watched him physically force my limp hand onto the glowing black screen of the digital notary pad. "It is perfect," Kendra whispered, her voice tight, with a powerful mixture of profound relief and deep, lingering anger. "He actually did it, Marcus. He sat right here in our home drinking our liquor, and he actively tried to poison you." "He was cornered," I said, looking at the frozen image of his cruel, laughing face on the bright screen. "The shadow investors from Chicago gave him exactly 72 hours to produce the money. The banking freeze pushed him all the way to the edge of a cliff, and his massive ego decided to jump." Kendra tapped the tablet screen, saving the high-resolution video file directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server. She looked up at me, her brown eyes shining with absolute, undeniable clarity. "He's going to call an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning," she said calmly. "He will present the forged biometric waiver to the executive committee, and he will demand that the bank freeze be lifted immediately. He truly thinks he holds the ultimate trump card." I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Vanessa. She answered on the very first ring, sounding wide awake and completely ready for absolute war. "We have the video," I said, leaning back against the warm wood of the living room bar. "It is clear as day, Vanessa. He drugged the drink on camera, and he physically forced the biometric signature while I pretended to be unconscious." Vanessa let out a low, deeply satisfied whistle on the other end of the line. "A felony," she said, her voice practically purring with intense professional excitement. "He just escalated a standard civil severance dispute into a Class 2 felony. Send the encrypted file to my secure inbox right now, Marcus. I need to prepare the final exhibition for the board members tomorrow. I will see you at 9 in the morning, I said, and calmly hung up the phone. I stood in silence, looking around my quiet, peaceful living room. The crystal glass of poisoned bourbon still sat on the small side table, catching the warm yellow light from the lamps. It was the physical, undeniable evidence of a dying, desperate empire. Reginald Vance truly thought he had outsmarted us all. He thought his endless money and his lifelong cruelty made him completely immune to the heavy consequences of his own actions. He was probably driving his rented car back to his luxury penthouse right now, laughing softly to himself in the dark, feeling like a king who had just successfully defended his massive castle. He was completely unaware that he had just voluntarily handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy him. Tomorrow morning, the hot summer sun was going to rise over the city of Atlanta, and by the time that sun finally set, the great and powerful Reginald Vance would not have a single piece of his beloved kingdom left to stand on. The morning sun hit the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta, burning away the thick summer humidity. Reginald Vance walked into the massive lobby of his corporate headquarters, and he did not look like a man who was running for his life. He wore a fresh charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored to his shoulders. His silver hair was combed back, and his chin was held incredibly high. Security guards quickly stepped out of his way, and the receptionist kept her eyes glued to her desk. He rode the private high-speed elevator up to the 50th floor, feeling the heavy, deeply satisfying weight of the forged waiver resting inside his leather briefcase. He had stared completely into the abyss just hours ago, but now he felt absolutely invincible. Inside the expansive, glass-walled boardroom, 7 executive committee members sat around a sprawling oak table. The room was tense, thick with the terrifying reality of the frozen bank accounts and the looming threat of total financial collapse. David, the chief financial officer, looked completely exhausted, nervously tapping a gold pen against his yellow legal pad. The other board members stared out the windows, avoiding eye contact, silently calculating how fast they could update their resumes. They knew about the missing collateral, and they knew the entire empire was currently bleeding to death. Reginald pushed the heavy glass doors open, walking into the room with the swagger of an undisputed king, returning from war. "Good morning, gentlemen," Reginald said, his voice booming aggressively across the quiet room. He walked directly to the head of the long table, refusing to sit down immediately. He wanted to tower over them to establish his complete dominance before he delivered his final victory. "I know the last 24 hours have been chaotic." Reginald continued, setting his leather briefcase on the smooth wood and opening it with a sharp snap. "Panic is a natural reaction to sudden turbulence, but I assure every single one of you the turbulence has completely passed." He reached into the dark briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He tossed them directly in front of David. The heavy slap of paper against the oak table echoed loudly, making 2 of the junior executives flinch in their seats. "What is this?" David asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses to read the bold heading on the top page. "That is our salvation," Reginald said smoothly, finally cutting his seat in the high-backed leather chair. "My former son-in-law paid me a surprise visit late last night. He was highly emotional and completely overwhelmed by the legal mess he had created." Reginald leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, scanning the faces of his terrified board. He realized very quickly that he could not possibly win a prolonged legal war against this institution. So, he came to my home. He offered a very tearful apology, and he voluntarily signed a complete waiver of his severance rights. The entire boardroom let out a collective gasp of pure shock. David scrambled to pick up the documents, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. He flipped to the final page, staring closely at the black digital signature box at the bottom. It has a certified biometric seal. David whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. The thermal heat index and the pressure capture are both completely verified by the global notary database. He actually signed this, Reginald. Reginald smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. Of course it is verified, Reginald said, leaning back in his chair with absolute arrogance. I told you he sat right in my living room and he signed it himself. The Section 14 clause is officially null and void. The severance claim is completely dissolved and my personal equity is fully restored to the company holdings. David looked up, the heavy color slowly returning to his pale, stressed face. If this is fully verified, David said, taking a deep breath, then the equity hold ordered by the court is no longer valid. We are entirely solvent again. Exactly. Reginald snapped, pointing a sharp finger directly at his chief financial officer. I want you to pick up your phone right now, David. I want you to call the primary lending banks, and I want you to fax them that exact document. Tell them the internal dispute is completely over and demand that they unfreeze our operating accounts this very second. A wave of incredible relief washed over the seated executives. They began to murmur among themselves, praising Reginald for his swift, decisive action. They praised his negotiating skills and his relentless business acumen. They truly believed the nightmare was over. They believed their massive corporate salaries and their luxurious country club lifestyles were completely safe. Reginald looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the sprawling city traffic below. He had done it. He had successfully outsmarted the violent shadow investors from Chicago. He had crushed the pathetic rebellion in his own family, and he had secured his legacy for another decade. He was completely untouchable, a god, among regular men. David picked up his sleek office phone, dialing the direct line to their primary bank manager. He put the call on speaker, resting the receiver on the desk, so the entire executive board could hear the glorious good news. The phone rang once, a loud, echoing trill in the quiet room. But before the bank manager could answer the line, a sudden violent noise shattered the calm atmosphere of the 50th floor. The heavy double oak doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were forcefully kicked open, slamming hard against the glass walls with a deafening crash. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. The heavy oak doors bounced violently against the glass walls, vibrating with the sheer force of the impact. Standing in the doorway, wearing a brilliant white suit and an expression of pure predatory joy, was Vanessa. She did not wait for an invitation, and she certainly did not ask for permission. She walked right into the executive boardroom, her sharp heels striking the polished floor like a ticking clock, echoing loudly in the completely silent room. I walked into the room right behind her, wearing my best charcoal suit, perfectly groomed, completely sober, and standing incredibly straight. Kendra walked right beside me, her head held high, looking at her father with absolute undeniable pity. Reginald jumped out of his high-backed leather chair, his face turning a dangerous, terrible shade of red. "Security," he screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at the open doors. "Get the guards up here right now. You are trespassing in my private building." Vanessa did not even look at him. She ignored his shouting, completely treating the so-called King of Atlanta like a noisy distraction. She walked directly to the center of the massive oak table, stopping right where David was sitting with his hand hovering over the active speakerphone. "Hang up the phone," Vanessa commanded quietly, her voice carrying absolute chilling authority. David swallowed hard, looking desperately at Reginald and then looking back at the terrifying, ruthless lawyer standing right over him. His hand trembled badly, but he pressed the red button, cutting the direct bank line completely dead. "What are you doing?" Reginald demanded, marching around the edge of the table, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "I have the signed waiver right there on the wood. Marcus surrendered the equity last night. This is a closed corporate matter." Vanessa reached into her leather bag and pulled out a massive red sealed folder. She dropped it right on top of the forged biometric waiver. The heavy, thick slap of the paper echoed sharply in the tense sweating room. I stepped forward, looking my father-in-law right in the eyes. "I did not surrender anything, Reginald," I said smoothly, keeping my voice low and perfectly calm, because I did not have anything left to surrender. Reginald stopped walking, his polished shoes scuffing against the carpet. Genuine, profound confusion washed over his red face, replacing the blind anger. "What in the world are you talking about?" he spat, pointing furiously at the black digital seal on the forged document. "I watched you sign it with my own two eyes. Your exact thermal print is right there on the page." Vanessa smiled, a cold, incredibly sharp expression that promised absolute ruin. "Read the trust documents, David," she instructed, tapping her manicured fingernail against the heavy red folder. "Open the file and read the official dates out loud for the entire executive committee to hear clearly." David pulled the heavy folder open, his hands shaking so violently that he almost dropped the crisp pages onto the floor. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, leaning in, close his eyes scanning rapidly over the dense, complex legal text. "This is an irrevocable blind trust establishment," David whispered, his voice cracking loudly in the quiet room. "Read the date of the primary transfer," David Vanessa said, leaning over the wide table, refusing to let him look away. David looked at the top right corner of the stamped page. The 18% equity share was legally transferred and fully vested into this protected trust on Tuesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, David read, his eyes going completely wide behind his lenses. Reginald grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table, his knuckles turning entirely white from the crushing pressure. Tuesday morning, he repeated the air completely, leaving his lungs in a single shallow gasp. "That is exactly right," Reginald Vanessa said, turning her head to face him fully. 48 hours before you showed up at Marcus and Kendra home crying those pathetic fake tears on their porch. 48 hours before you pulled that expensive stolen digital pad out of your oversized sweater. Marcus legally transferred his entire 18% share into an ironclad, legally untouchable blind trust. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the broken old man. "Do you know what that actually means?" "Reginald?" she asked, her voice dropping into a dangerous, mocking whisper. "It means that even if Marcus desperately wanted to sign your fake waiver last night, he legally could not do it. He did not own the shares anymore. The private trust owned them. Your fancy biometric document is completely, entirely worthless." The entire executive board sat in stunned, absolute silence. The glorious financial salvation they had happily celebrated just 2 minutes ago was entirely destroyed. The mandatory bank freeze was still fully active. The operating money was still gone. Reginald stared blankly at the red folder, his mind spinning wildly out of control, desperately searching for a way out of the trap. "But the biometric seal," he stammered, pointing a trembling, weak finger at the forged paper. "The court database verified it this morning. It is a legally binding signature." I stepped right up to the table, standing directly in front of him, letting him see the complete clarity in my eyes. "It is my signature, Reginald," I said quietly, leaning in close. "I freely gave it to you. I let you grab my heavy hand, and I let you press my thumb onto your little glass pad, because I wanted you to truly think you had won." Reginald looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terrifying realization. He looked like a man who had just confidently stepped off the edge of a very tall building and finally realized halfway down that he forgot his parachute. "You let me take it," Reginald whispered, his voice completely hollow, echoing in the massive room. "We let you take it," Kendra said, stepping up right to my side, looking down at the man who had tormented her mother for 20 years. "And we needed you to present that forged document to the board of directors on the official corporate record in front of all these witnesses." The junior executives started whispering frantically to each other, quietly pushing their heavy leather chairs back from the table, desperately wanting to put distance between themselves and the sinking ship. David looked down at his yellow notepad, looking like he was going to be physically sick right there on the polished wood. Vanessa picked up her sleek silver tablet from the table, holding it up high for the entire executive room to clearly see. "Forging a legal corporate document is a serious state crime, Reginald," she said smoothly, tapping the glass screen. "But doing it to deliberately defraud a major financial institution while simultaneously trying to cover up $50 million of illegal shadow debt from Chicago, well, that requires a completely different kind of presentation." Vanessa walked over to the massive black glass media console sitting at the far end of the executive boardroom. She did not ask for the access code. She simply reached behind the primary monitor and plugged a sleek white cable directly into her silver tablet. The enormous 80-inch presentation screen on the wall behind Reginald instantly flickered to life. The bright blue light washed over the terrified faces of the executive committee. "Look at the screen, gentlemen," Vanessa commanded, stepping back so everyone had a perfectly clear view. The high-definition video began to play, completely silent but absolutely devastating. The wide-angle camera showed my peaceful, warmly lit living room. It showed the heavy crystal glasses sitting on the custom bar, and it showed Reginald Vance sitting on my leather sofa. The board members leaned forward, their eyes completely glued to the massive monitor. They watched as Reginald, wearing the pathetic, oversized gray sweater, suddenly sat up perfectly straight. "Micah," David whispered, bringing a shaking hand up to cover his mouth. They watched in horrifying 4,000 pixel clarity as the frail old man reached into his pocket and pulled out the small plastic travel vial. The hidden microphone audio kicked in, projecting the tiny wet sound of the glass dropper echoing through the boardroom speakers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 drops of clear, heavy pharmaceutical poison falling directly into my glass of expensive bourbon. Reginald turned completely white, his skin looking like wet paper. "Turn it off," he screamed, lunging desperately toward the media console, his hands reaching wildly for the white cable. "Turn that fabricated garbage off right now." I stepped directly into his path, blocking him completely. I did not raise my hands, and I did not flinch. "Sit down, Reginald," I said, my voice dropping into a low, absolute register that left absolutely no room for debate. "You wanted to show the board what happened last night, so we are going to show them exactly what happened." Reginald stumbled backward, his legs suddenly failing him, and collapsed heavily into his high-backed leather chair. He stared up at the massive screen, completely paralyzed by the undeniable truth of his own actions. The video continued to play mercilessly. It showed me faking the heavy slumber, slumping down into my armchair. It showed Reginald jumping off the sofa, moving with ruthless speed, pulling the black digital notary pad from his pocket. The executives watched in absolute stunned silence as their powerful, untouchable CEO grabbed my limp hand and forcefully pressed my thumb against the glowing screen. "That is an incredibly clear recording of a Class 2 felony," Vanessa announced to the silent room, pacing slowly behind the row of seated executives. "Attempted poisoning, aggravated assault, and the deliberate forgery of a legal corporate document." David looked at Reginald, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. "You drugged him," David said, his voice shaking with pure revulsion. "You went to his home and you poisoned your own son-in-law to save your equity. I did it to save the company." Reginald shouted, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual booming power. "I did it to save all of your jobs." He stole the equity he was going to let the banks tear us apart. Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She tapped her silver tablet again, and the video on the massive screen disappeared instantly, replaced by a complex, highly detailed spreadsheet. It was a massive web of offshore routing numbers, dummy holding corporations, and hidden wire transfers. "He did not do it to save your jobs," Vanessa said, pointing a sharp finger at the glowing numbers on the screen. "He did it to save himself from the men holding the leash around his neck." The board members squinted at the complex spreadsheet, trying to decipher the massive flow of missing money. "Let me simplify it for you," Vanessa said smoothly. 3 years ago, your brilliant, untouchable CEO made a catastrophic investment in a midtown commercial zoning project. It failed completely. Instead of taking the loss and reporting it to this board, he borrowed $50 million from unregulated, highly violent shadow investors operating out of Chicago. A loud murmur of pure panic rippled through the boardroom. Shadow investors, one of the junior executives, repeated his voice, practically squeaking with terror. "Exactly," Vanessa nodded, tapping the screen to highlight a massive column of red numbers. "To pay the exorbitant monthly interest on that illegal loan, Reginald has been systematically embezzling from your primary corporate operating funds, hiding the missing money inside fake vendor contracts. And to secure the primary principal, he secretly pledged the entire corporate equity pool as collateral, including Marcus, 18%. David looked at the spreadsheet, his mathematical brain quickly piecing together the terrifying reality. "The bank freeze," David whispered, staring blankly at the polished oak table. "The courts froze the accounts, so the interest payment bounced. And the Chicago investors realized the collateral was legally locked up," Kendra added, stepping forward to stand next to me. "They gave him 72 hours to produce the cash, or they were going to take his life. That is why he showed up at my door crying like a broken child trying to steal the equity back. He's not a king, David. He is just a terrified old man hiding from a very large debt." Reginald sat in his chair, completely broken, staring blankly at the massive spreadsheet illuminating his total ruin. His beautiful, carefully constructed empire was completely exposed, revealed to be nothing more than a hollow shell built entirely on stolen money and desperate lies. The board members, the men who had feared and worshipped him for decades, were now looking at him like he was a dangerous, diseased animal. The air in the room was incredibly heavy, thick with the smell of absolute, undeniable defeat. The heavy silence in the boardroom was finally broken by the distant wailing sound of sirens. The sound drifted up from the busy Atlanta streets, piercing the thick glass of the 50th floor windows. Reginald Vance slowly lifted his head, his eyes empty and bloodshot, listening to the high-pitched noise growing steadily louder. I stepped right up to the edge of the massive oak table, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked down at the man who had spent 14 years trying to make me feel small. "You called me a passenger, Reginald," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. "You stood on a stage in front of 300 people and you told the entire city that I did not know how to fight. You thought your money made you completely untouchable, and you thought my patience was a sign of weakness." Reginald did not argue. He did not shout. He just sat there breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "You built this massive company on the bruised backs of good, hard-working people," I continued, never breaking eye contact. "You humiliated your wife, you pushed away your daughter, and you treated your employees like disposable garbage. You thought respect was something you could buy or force out of people. But arrogance writes checks, Reginald, that justice will always inevitably cash." The wailing sirens abruptly stopped echoing loudly at the base of the massive glass building. Down in the marble lobby, I knew exactly what was happening. The heavy, polished elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a sharp metallic ping. Heavy footsteps marched quickly down the plush corridor carpet. The oak doors of the boardroom were pushed open again, but this time it was not Vanessa. 4 uniformed Atlanta police officers, led by 2 plainclothes detectives holding thick arrest warrants, walked right into the room. Their duty belts jingled loudly, a harsh, metallic sound that signaled the absolute end of the Vance empire. Reginald Vance, the lead detective, said, stepping up to the head of the table, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Please stand up and place your hands flat on the table." Reginald did not move. He stared blindly at the silver cuffs, his mind completely unable to process the reality of his total ruin. He was the king of Atlanta real estate. He dined with mayors and senators. Men like him did not get arrested in their own boardrooms. "Stand up right now," the detective commanded, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, grabbing Reginald by his expensive suit jacket and forcefully pulling him up from his high-backed leather chair. Reginald stumbled awkwardly, his knees buckling under his own weight. The detective grabbed his wrists, pulling them roughly behind his back. The sharp, mechanical click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed incredibly loud in the silent room. "You are under arrest," the detective recited, his voice completely flat and professional. "You are being charged with aggravated assault, felony forgery, and massive corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent, and considering what we have on video, I strongly suggest you use it." The board of directors sat frozen in their chairs, watching their tyrant fall completely from grace. David took off his glasses, rubbing his exhausted eyes, finally breathing freely for the first time in 3 years. The officers turned Reginald around, marching him toward the open boardroom doors. As they dragged him past me, he stopped pulling against their grip. He turned his head, looking at me, and then looking at Kendra. His face was a mask of pure, absolute defeat. "You took everything," Reginald whispered, his voice trembling and weak. I shook my head slowly, feeling absolutely nothing for him. "I did not take anything, Reginald," I said quietly, watching the officers pull him toward the hallway. "I just let you burn it all down by yourself." They marched the broken old man out of the room, down the long corridor and into the waiting elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him inside and taking him down to a reality he was completely unprepared for. The King of Atlanta was gone, completely stripped of his crown, his money, and his freedom. Vanessa calmly unplugged her tablet, slipping it back into her leather bag. The boardroom was completely quiet again, but the heavy, oppressive fear was entirely gone. I looked at Kendra, and she offered me a small, incredibly genuine smile. The long, exhausting war was finally over, and the air in the room suddenly felt perfectly clean. 6 months later, the towering glass facade of Vance Enterprise looked exactly the same, but everything inside had completely changed. The empire did not fall apart slowly. It shattered like a heavy mirror dropped directly onto hard concrete. Reginald Vance did not get bail. The judge, a man who had politely attended Reginald's retirement gala just months before, looked at the high-definition poisoning video and denied his release immediately. The shadow investors from Chicago, realizing their $50 million was completely gone, quietly disappeared back into the dark. They knew better than to fight the federal government and the aggressive asset forfeiture teams over a frozen corporate account. Jasmine, the young, beautiful wife who married a king, filed for divorce the very next morning. She packed 3 massive designer suitcases, took whatever cash she had safely hidden away, and left the Buckhead penthouse before the police even finished their primary search warrant. She did not visit him in the county lockup. She did not even send a lawyer. She just vanished, moving on to the next wealthy target, leaving Reginald completely alone to face the absolute wreckage of his own life. The mighty real estate titan, the man who once yelled at waiters for pouring the wrong vintage of expensive wine, now wore a bright orange jumpsuit that did not fit his shrinking frame. His silver hair, once perfectly styled and thick, grew thin and entirely unkempt. The county lockup did not care about his massive ego or his former net worth. He spent his days pushing a heavy, wet mop across the cold, gray concrete floors of the chaotic cell block. He cleaned up after violent men who did not know his name and absolutely did not care about the massive buildings he used to own. Sometimes he would pause his mopping, leaning heavily against the wooden handle and stare blankly at the small barred window at the top of the wall. He would look at the tiny patch of blue Atlanta sky, and he would finally realize the devastating truth. He was not a victim of a vicious plot. He was the sole architect of his own personal hell. While Reginald washed floors in the dark, Kendra and I spent the summer cleaning the heavy rot out of the company. The board of directors, terrified of facing federal criminal conspiracy charges, voluntarily resigned one by one. We completely dissolved the toxic, high-risk real estate divisions, paid off the legitimate debts, and consolidated the clean, profitable assets under a brand new name. The 18% equity safely sitting in the legal blind trust gave us absolute uncontested control of the new stabilized foundation. But neither of us wanted to sit in that massive corner office on the 50th floor. We did not want to spend the rest of our lives managing a corporate kingdom we had just violently conquered. We wanted peace. So on a bright Tuesday morning in September, we called a young man named Julian into the newly remodeled boardroom. Julian was a brilliant, hardworking junior analyst who had spent 5 years working in the basement accounting department. Reginald used to mock him constantly, calling him slow, and repeatedly passing him over for well-deserved promotions. But I knew his absolute worth, and Kendra knew his deep, quiet loyalty. I handed him the heavy operational reins of the entire company, making him the new chief executive officer. He looked at the legal documents completely stunned, and he promised he would run the company with absolute integrity. I looked in his eyes, and I knew he meant every single word. Kendra and I walked out of the towering glass building together, holding hands, peeping right out into the warm, beautiful Atlanta sun. We did not look back at the massive marble lobby, and we did not look up at the 50th floor. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Vance legacy was finally broken, scattered to the wind, like completely useless dust. We walked down Peachtree Street completely free, ready to build a quiet, beautiful life of our own. Respect is the only currency that never depreciates. When you build your kingdom on the bruised backs of good people, do not be surprised when those same people pull the foundation right out from under you. Arrogance writes checks that justice will always inevitably cash. Keep your spirit humble.